Hi, everybody. My name is Julian. I'm here from not so sunny New York City. It's a very rainy day. I'm here with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung NYC office, and we're just going to let some of the attendees join. As they join, I'll speak through the purpose of us being here today to celebrate Black History Month and really American history. But I really thank you all for joining me here today. I'm joined by 4 fantastic panelists with great deep historical knowledges of the cities that we'll be discussing today and the Great Migration. I want to also just introduce our office. The Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung NYC office opened in 2012, so just over 10 years ago. And we do a lot of civic education work on progressive causes. We're a German political foundation, and we operate internationally. So there's offices all around the world doing sort of local work. The NYC office in particular covers North America as a whole. So we'll be talking about Los Angeles today, Chicago, Buffalo, so not just New York City. I also want to thank all of our panelists for joining us one more time. I think Black History Month is American history, and I think when we talk about what Black History Month is, we have to talk about essentially American history and the historical processes of migration in America. So for Black History Month, we're going to discuss the Great Migration. And this is really about 60 years of 6 million people moving across about 2 waves. And our panelists will break down a little bit about the differences between the first and the second wave. I am joined to discuss these 4 cities, New York City, by Dr. Carla Dubose Simmons, and she is at SUNY in Westchester, and she is, Assistant Professor of History at SUNY Westchester. Dr. Henry Lewis Taylor Jr. will speak about Buffalo. He is a professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, at the University of Buffalo. Dr. Peter Cole is a professor of history at Western Illinois University. And Dr. Faustina DuCros is an associate professor and undergraduate major advisor of sociology and interdisciplinary social sciences at San Jose State University. Once again, thank you all for joining us, joining me in discussing the Great Migration. I guess we'll start with New York City and Dr. Carla Dubose Simmons. So Dr. Dubose, if you can just speak about the Great Migration, when did the first Black migrants begin to arrive in New York City? And why did they leave the South? And why did they come to New York City in particular? So what were the sort of pull and push factors in leaving the South to come to New York?
Yeah, so New York has such a long history of African-American settlement, right, going back, preceding. I won't go too far back. I know we're focusing on the Great Migration today, but I just happened to be teaching a class about Black New York, and students were asking, well, the origins of Black New York, and we could go back for such a long time. But in terms of thinking about where African-Americans are settling in New York, I think we often immediately go to Harlem, right? That's our mind. Our mind's eye immediately goes to Harlem. And African-Americans really begin to settle in Harlem around the turn of the 20th century, right? It's not always been an African-American community. It was suburban, it was unevenly settled. There's new work on Philip Payton, who is a Black real estate developer who really opened up African-Americans, Harlem to African-American settlement. But really, we see this explosion of a Black population in New York City and primarily in Harlem during World War I. Right? That's sort of that moment where we begin to see, talking about push and pull factors, these job opportunities open up for African-Americans that begin to attract African-Americans to come to New York City. So push and pull factors, what's pushing African-Americans to leave the South? And I know any number of factors, and I know my colleagues will also mention these factors as well. Racism, discrimination, Jim Crow, segregation laws, right, formal segregation laws in southern states, as well as disenfranchisement of African Americans through the use of literacy tests, grandfather clauses. There also was a boll weevil infestation of a cotton crop in the South that really pushes African Americans who are primarily farmers out of the South. And so what pulls African Americans to come northward are jobs, factory jobs that open up to African Americans due to a labor shortage caused by World War I, conversion to wartime and production, men leaving the country to fight in the war really creates a labor shortage, and African Americans, along with women, find job opportunities that pay more in factories that had not been open to them before. And so this is what really perpetuates African Americans to begin to move. But beyond that, the opportunity to organize, to create formal institutions, to engage in political organizing and vote and engage in politics openly in a way that they didn't have the opportunity to do in the South, I think were additional pull factors, opportunities to create institutions, Black businesses. And so that would be the first Great Migration. Primarily, the Black population continues to settle in New York during that migration. I think we were periodized, right? And that migration, though it begins during World War I, 1914, it lasted up until the Great Depression, right? 1930 roughly. But the migration slows down a great deal during the Great Depression, but it never stops to New York. The second wave of the Great Migration we would mark the beginning of that with World War II. And colleagues, feel free to jump in, right? I feel like I'm sort of introducing. So World War II begins 1939. And so again, the labor shortage opening up opportunities really attract African Americans to renew their migration to centers, New York City, but also the other cities we'll be talking about today. And so I think that's kind of the background story.
Awesome. And if I could just follow up a question. So between the first and second waves, we know there's two wars, World War I and World War II. Are the jobs that African Americans, Black people are seeking primarily the same between the two waves of generation? Or was there maybe some differences between the first and second wave, maybe employment opportunities that opened up for a second wave that weren't available for the first wave?
Yeah, I do think that there are some differences in those two waves of migration in terms of the factory work. Now, my work is on World War II, so I'm not exactly sure what jobs are opening up during World War I to African Americans and what industries and how it breaks down. But what we do see as a difference in these two periods is just the sheer size of the migration. If we look at some census data, from 1910 to 1920, approximately 60,000 African Americans migrate to New York. This would be the first wave, but during the second wave, it's approximately 200,000, and that's just a huge difference in terms of the amount of African Americans who are migrating. That's one big difference. I also think that we see mobilization around employment opportunity as a civil right in a way during World War II that we did not see during World War I. I think that the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns of the 1930s, the emergence of the federal government as during the New Deal era as sort of in a new role in which it's more involved in the lives of American citizens and the economy, really set up a situation in which increasingly African-American activists are looking to economic methods or approaches or strategies to improve the conditions of African-Americans, and that during the World War II era, it's an open opportunity to engage in that kind of organizing. I think that we do see that as one of the primary differences between the effects of the migration and how it's sort of the job opportunities that are open and available to African-Americans in the World War II era.
Okay. And if you could just speak more about maybe some of the neighborhoods during the second wave of migration that Black people were settling in, and did they stay in these neighborhoods, or did they branch out? What were some of the issues within the neighborhood?
That's also one of the big differences, I would say. Primarily African Americans were settling in Harlem in the first wave of the Great Migration, but because so many African Americans were moving to Harlem, Harlem was the primary place for Black settlement. It was also the intellectual and cultural center of Black New York and arguably Black America, that, African Americans really settled there, tended to go there, and couldn't move outside of Harlem because of discrimination in rental and housing policies. So during the second Great Migration, with this larger influx of African Americans, we do see African Americans settling in areas outside of Harlem. Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn becomes known as Little Harlem. It becomes the second central area of Black settlement. Wendell Pritchett has written a book about Black Brownsville, which is a neighborhood adjacent to Bedford-Stuyvesant. And so some Black migrants who are coming from the South are settling directly, right? Coming from the South and settling in Bedford-Stuyvesant. There is also some secondary migration where the migrants settle in Harlem and then find out about job opportunities and war industries in Brooklyn and move there. But we also see Harlem is continuing to be overcrowded with more and more people living in Harlem. The quality of the housing stock is declining. It's also older. And so we see more dilapidated housing emerging. And so I think in some respects, we have this sort of class issue where middle-class African Americans, as more and more migrants are coming to New York City, are looking for greener pastures. And so we begin to see some middle-class African Americans leaving Harlem and moving to Southwest Bronx neighborhood, Morrisania. They call it the Prospect Boulevard section, but it's in the Southwest Bronx. So those are some of the areas that we see. Other areas outside of Harlem where African Americans are settling.
That's great. And I guess my sort of final question is about the organizing that you spoke about. So maybe with the second wave of migration, there's more opportunities for organizing. What specifically were Black people organizing for? I know this is about, access to jobs, but what types of jobs? And also what types of sort of failings of the state, failings of the city to accommodate them and the new arrivals were they organizing around?
I think we see a lot of organizing that looks to be collaborative with the state. And I think it's both the attention to collaborate with state institutions that are looking to integrate war industries. I think we see at both the federal and state level, there are wartime agencies that are established to end discriminatory employment practices in war industries, right? And corporations that have contracts with the military for production. And so African-American organizations, right? Some are more mainstream, right? Like the NAACP, the National Urban League. And then there are leftist organizations that are collaborating with labor unions. So like the National Negro Congress or the Negro Labor Victory Committee. And they are looking to I think, employ several strategies to kind of bring unfair hiring practices to the forefront and really expose what they see as a contradiction in the position of the United States government, right? In a government that is protecting democracy abroad, while allowing African Americans to experience discrimination, right? And suffer, right? Not experience, suffer discrimination at home. And so those, right, known as the Double V campaigns, I think there is this concerted effort to use the press, the Black press, to exploit that, to, really demonstrate industries that were, had contracts with the federal government that were engaging in discriminatory hiring practices to force both the state and federal government to address this issue. To embarrass the state and federal government. And in some ways, we do see some successes in terms of opening skilled and semi-skilled jobs to African-American workers. Those skilled and semi-skilled jobs largely were not open to Black workers in industries. Really, factory work was quite difficult for African-Americans to get, period. But even those jobs in industries, in factories, African-American workers were able to attain were usually service jobs, janitorial jobs, unskilled work, low paid work. And so the pressure that's exerted through these campaigns, through boycotts, through pickets and marches outside of the headquarters of these corporations were to bring negative publicity onto the corporations themselves, but also to draw the attention of state and federal fair employment practices agencies to begin to investigate discriminatory hiring. And though those agencies didn't really have much enforcement power, the investigations themselves prompted some of those industries to open up skilled and semi-skilled jobs to Black workers. This was an uneven process. It doesn't happen in every single industry. It doesn't happen in every single corporation or company either, but we do see some successes. And I just want to note that New York State passes a permanent anti-discrimination law when it comes to employment practices that apply to all employment sectors, not just war industries. And that, I think, was really key to and central to maintaining some of the gains that Black workers made into the post-war era.
Thank you. And I think when you bringing up New York State is a good way to sort of segue to Dr. Henry Louis Taylor Jr. When we talk about Buffalo and Black people maybe reaping some of the protections that you know the second wave of migrants and the organizing in New York City happened, and how that affected New York State. So when did the first migrants arrive to Buffalo? And why? What in particular were some of the pull factors for Buffalo, New York? Because it's a lot further in Western New York than New York City, I guess, if you're coming up from the South. So were there particular pull factors for Buffalo to attract Black people from the South? And sort of further to that, what were some of the neighborhoods that Black people settled in Buffalo?
Buffalo tended to have a history in relationship to African Americans that differ a lot from other Midwestern cities and other East Coast cities. The migratory route was basically the same as New York City, with people coming up from Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and South Carolina, and to a much lesser extent, places like Alabama, Louisiana, and my own home state of Nashville. But during that first wave, only a super small handful of Black folks came to Buffalo. As late as 1940, only around 17,000 African Americans lived in the city. And so that first small handful of workers settled in near downtown, in those neighborhoods we refer to as the Lower East Side. And they settled in waterfront neighborhoods and communities. And in that moment of time, the African-American population did not spatially separate from the white population, but they were intermingled in the white immigrant population. And at that time, they made a distinction between immigrant whites and what they would call native whites, which is an odd way to describe white folks as native whites. But Americans were considered those whites that had been gone, and they called out these other individuals by their own ethnic groups. So African Americans lived intermingled with the Polish, the Irish, Germans, and their community was most integrated. And I use that word more. They shared residential space, much more so than integration, mostly with the Russian Jewish population in the city. And we have data and evidence suggesting that in many instances, not only did they live on the same block, but in a number of occasions, they actually shared residential spaces within the boarding houses and the apartment building. Now, that doesn't mean to say this was an age of kumbaya. It was an age where people lived together, although we have data that suggests that some Blacks even learned German so they could hang out and party with the Germans. But it was a relatively small population that was integrated with others, and they tend to work in and around the factory districts, and was most heavily concentrated at the heartbeat of the factory district, living in these waterfront neighborhoods along with the immigrant white population. So the large movement of Blacks does not occur until the period between 1940 and around 1970, when that period ends. And in that period, you have some 90,000 African Americans pouring into the city as the population reaches around 94, 95,000 African Americans. And the conditions under which they are moving into the city are radically different than in the earlier period. In the period between 1940 and 1950, when that other element of the mechanization of agriculture and the New Deal policies begin to eliminate agriculture as a way of life. And by that, I mean to say, by the time the first migration starts, Black people are the most rural of all Americans. By the time that migratory period ends, African Americans are the most urban of all Americans, and virtually all Blacks by that moment in time are urban dwellers. But in the second great migration, that's when the knowledge city begins to emerge, following the dynamics of World War II, this new knowledge city based upon a service, high technology and the like, begins to emerge. That's also the period when I like to say the great home ownership rush begins to occur. And whites are rushing into the suburban areas to take advantage of the new homeowner opportunities, because it's not until the 1930s and the Depression era that the mechanisms are developed to create mass home ownership. And that's when Frederick Babcock develops these new land use theories. The amortization mortgage system is put into place, and the states launch these mass home ownership campaigns. But the campaigns don't start until after the Second World War. So people often talk about the home ownership being the American dream. And I always remind folks, well, people didn't start having that dream until after World War II. And I also emphasize that white people were not fleeing the city, running away from incoming Blacks, but this was a home ownership rush, because the new home ownership was being developed out into the suburban areas and regions, not in the core. The cores were already built up. And if you look at the 1940 HOLC maps and 30 HOLC maps, all of these areas where Blacks were moving into, including New York City, were already considered in a state of decline and decay. So as Blacks entered places like Buffalo, these cities were undergoing radical transformation and change, dominated by massive levels of deconstruction caused by urban renewal, massive levels of highway building and construction, high levels of transformation, etc. And if we jump up to New York, that's when folks absorb more urban renewal dollars in New York than all of the other places in the state combined. So you have these massive levels of construction that were going on. And so as Blacks moved into the cities, many of the neighborhoods and the communities that they moved into were being destroyed almost as soon as they got there. So there was this constant flux of movement that occurred. So the larger point that I'm making, in the second migration, Blacks confronted a highly turbulent transforming urban community in which they were attempting to find their place in time, when many of the jobs that were lured them to the north, those jobs were disappearing almost as quickly as they got them, as the system was reconstructing a new environment that would find yet a new way to place them at the bottom. In a large sense, in that moment of the second Great Migration, a new Black inequality was being born.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. I think Black people are almost escaping segregation and inequality that was explicit in practice in the South, and especially the Jim Crow South, and going to the North while a new sort of less explicit segregation was being formed. One that's
one that would soon engulf the entire nation. And in many ways, what was occurring in the North, all of which was happening at the same time that the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement began to rage, was a prelude to the new world that was being born in the South. They were running out of the pot into the frying pan.
And I guess my follow-up question would be, what was the Black response in Buffalo in particular? What organizing took place to sort of maybe try and help increase access for something like home ownership?
It was a significant fight back. I mean, although in the South, the question of integration raged, in Buffalo, it was about self-determination. And self-determination being defined as the capacity and the ability to control the land on which your community is being built. And so Buffalo's community moved into a large area known as the Buffalo's East Side. And there were multiple neighborhoods that existed within the East Side, but the East Side as a place had its own sense of space. And so when people talk about Buffalo, they talk about one place, as opposed to when they talk about Black New York, they're talking about multiple places. But in Buffalo, it was the East Side, and the East Side was the old factory district. And it was a place where the largest concentration of white folks lived. So as Blacks were moving in, they were moving out. And so in many instances, Blacks thought they were segregating, integrating a neighborhood and a community, but it was like two ships passing in the night. So they built organizations to gain control over the space that they occupied. The most significant effort in this period, which occurs in around the mid-60s, was the building a build organization that was based on the Saul-Alinsky model from Chicago. And that build stood for build unity, independence, liberty, and dignity. And it was an organization that was truly community-wide. Literally everybody that lived in Black Buffalo was a member of Build Organization. And Build Organization fought on multiple fronts, from housing to employment to neighborhood improvement to housing and the like. And each year there would be a big, massive election campaign to determine who the leadership of that organization was. And in 1968, it was led by a guy by the name of Bill Gator. Buffalo also, through Build, established an independent school, Build Academy, which was one of, I mean, they didn't call it a charter school, but that was a part of, it was like a charter school in the sense that they had the right and privilege to hire their own teachers, set their curriculum, and do a number of other things of that nature, which was again a part of that quest of self determination. They also built a chapter of in the late 60s of the Black Panther Party that was located in the area. And around that same time, an organization called the Black Workers Organization that grew out of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers down in Detroit. And all of that is in a period of a major riot in 1967. So anchoring that whole effort was this massive level of organizing, massive level of fight backs, both organizing on the streets, but also the organization of workers. An organization called the Third World Workers Organization was built to organize those Black workers in the steel mills who were in the hardest, dirtiest jobs in that level. And the period peaks in 1977 when Art E., a guy that went on and made a name for himself as a state assembly person, almost captured the mayorship in Buffalo, New York, as Blacks as in Buffalo and elsewhere attempted to leverage their numbers into the ability and capacity to gain political control. So in the midst of the chaos, the displacement, replacement, and other activities that were occurring, Blacks fought back by building organizations and trying to imagine a very different future for their people.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I think we'll stick with the Midwest when we talk about Chicago. And I want to bring in Dr. Peter Cole and ask him essentially the same question as to when the first Black migrants arrived in Chicago.
And the Buffalonians thank Chicago for sending Saul Linsky and his organizing crew up that way.
Yeah, I think there's also a similarity. I know Dr. Cole also wrote about season 2 of The Wire and talked about some of the unions on the docks. So yeah, just to bring you in and ask you the same question as to when the first Black migrants arrived and essentially what were the pull factors for Chicago in particular?
Well, it's a pleasure, by the way, to be on this panel, and thanks for being invited to join it. You know, the first person who was not a native person to Chicago was a Black man, right? Jean-Baptiste Pointe-du-Sable was from what now is called Haiti, but came in through the Great Lakes and around 1780, married a local woman who was Potawatomi named Kitty Hawa, and set up a trading outpost on what became land that is part of the city of Chicago. So that was in the 1780s. The city of Chicago wasn't founded until the 1830s. Chicago was small, but then the Civil War started to grow dramatically. It exploded in size. So from 1860 on the eve of the Civil War, it was 100,000 people. 1890, 1 million people. Very few of those people were Black. Like others already have said, it's really World War I that sort of sparks that first Great Migration nationwide, but to Chicago specifically. So say in 1910, the US Census tells us that about 40,000 African Americans lived in Chicago. 1920, 100,000, right? Like, and really it's the second half of the 19-teens that sort of all that increase happens. Labor shortages set off this stampede because Blacks have good reason to leave the South. They just never could be hired by employers outside of the South because employers chose to hire other people, right? And so Black men and Black women sort of seize the opportunity to flee racial terrorism and Jim Crow South for what they hope are, I won't say greener pastures, considering it's winter in Chicago, but like sort of better economic fortunes, right? Like, you know, that continues into the 20s, although I'd be happy to talk, not happy, but could talk about the 1919 race riot. But in the 1920s and 30s, right, Black folks continue to move into Chicago. The Depression really doesn't stop it, right? Like explodes again in the 40s, 50s, right? The so-called second wave. But, you know, in the 19 teens and then the 1920s, really, I would say Chicago defines the Great Migration, right? The sort of most well-known newspaper, perhaps within the sort of the Black press, is a Chicago Defender, right? It's telling Southern Blacks to sort of leave the South, but it's also telling Southern Blacks to come to Chicago, right? And tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands do, right? And so just sort of the who's who, right? Louis Armstrong, of course, before he moves to New York City, Nat King Cole, Sam Cooke, Dinah Washington, Quincy Jones, Herbie Hancock, Mahalia Jackson, right? Like Richard Wright, Ida B. Wells, Gwendolyn Brooks, Jesse Owens, Joe Louis, right? It's like all within sort of actually a few neighborhoods on the South Side, which is to say south of the Loop, which is the sort of the central business district, becomes sort of a mecca, right? And the most well-known neighborhood, well, it was called the Black Belt, but that was, of course, a term used by white people because the term Black was not a positive term. The term colored and Negro were the terms of choice, right? And so the Black Belt was a pejorative term to describe where most people of African descent lived. And it was in the 1930s, famously, that a rival newspaper of the Defender, the Chicago Bee, no longer alive, holds basically a contest, and they renamed the neighborhood informally Bronzeville. Bronzeville becomes a name that many, many people are familiar with, especially because of the works of Gwendolyn Brooks, not a native of Chicago, but a migrant, but who writes lovingly about her adopted home. That's also where Ida B. Wells lives for 50 years after she flees Tennessee, threatened with lynching, et cetera, right? Like, and so Chicago really sort of comes to define, like I said, I think the Black experience outside of the South, not just because of the Defender, but then after World War II, the creation of Ebony and Jet magazines, right? Sort of really sort of define sort of for Black people by Black people what is mid-century America, right? Like for them, and like Dr. Taylor said, and that is an urban experience, right? Like in contrast to the South, where it was a rural experience.
So I think one thing you mentioned, and I think all of these cities might have a significant history with these, is riots. So if you could speak more about the 1919 riot and maybe some of your work around that.
Yes, of course. Well, so African Americans fleeing the South thought they were moving to a better place, and I would suggest that they were. The fact that they continued to move suggests that they were making a choice, right? Like they were able to vote, right? And in fact, the first congressman from outside the South to be elected since Reconstruction, right, was an African American from Chicago, right? Like they continued to come, but unfortunately, although there's no formal laws that segregate or discriminate based upon race in practice, so-called de facto segregation was alive and well. So the year after World War I ends, 1919, hot summer, no air conditioning. Everyone goes out of doors when it's hot in urban places because it's cooler on the street and outside. In Chicago, they went to, and I would say we still go to the lake, right, on the east side of the city because it's cooler, even if you can't swim. There was only one beach that allowed Black people to swim, right? And it's got a 20-mile coast, and Black folks were allowed, quote unquote, to go to 25th Street, which is on the south side in this neighborhood called Bronzeville now, right? 5 Black children went swimming one Sunday afternoon, July 27th, on a particularly hot day, maybe approaching 100 degrees plus humidity, and they go swimming, right? They had a raft they had maintained and sort of created and sort of hid by the coast for sort of such escapades. They swim. What happens when you go swimming on a raft? Well, you don't stay in one place, right? You drift, right? Like they drifted southward and essentially drifted across an invisible line in the waters of Lake Michigan into a so-called white part of Lake Michigan, right? And then a white man on the beach started throwing rocks at these children. And one of those children, Eugene Williams, was killed, right? A 17-year-old boy, right? His friends swam back to the coast, ran a few blocks south, identified the killer to the police, who refused to arrest the white man, and tensions escalated from there, right? So the failure to basically do the most basic sort of policing is the spark, the deeper causes of the same issues that everyone could talk about in the cities of destination, right? Like, and that night, gangs, ethnic gangs of Irish Americans and Irish people, boys and men, invaded the Black Belt, right, and started killing random Black people, right? And it escalated from there over the course of a week. And after approximately a week, 38 people were killed. Over 500 people were injured, right? 2/3 of those people were Black, 1/3 white, which is interesting, right? In the same summer, the New York City resident Claude McKay wrote a poem, If We Must Die, a famous poem of the early Harlem Renaissance. A number of people killed were white by Black people in self-defense as white mobs attacked them. Black people armed themselves, right? Like, and so unlike, say, the Tulsa Race Massacre or any number of other incidents where all of the dead were African-American, the Chicago race riots saw actually a number of white people also killed by Black people in self-defense. So 38 people killed, still the worst incident of racial violence in the city's history. If I could just say one other thing about what Dr. Taylor said, segregation did not exist in Chicago in the same way before World War I as it did after, right? And so segregation increased over time by neighborhood. And we argue, part of a group called the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project, that was because of the racial violence that basically elites in the city, white elites, embraced restrictive covenants and subsequently other techniques in order to sort of contain African Americans to certain neighborhoods, because violence is sort of ugly, not really controlled very effectively. It's not sort of the right look. Right, you can do it actually clean and neat and subtle and legal, right, through various other means, right? And so as more African Americans move in, just like actually Dr. Dubose Simmons was talking about, these neighborhoods become more and more crowded, right? Because African Americans can't leave these neighborhoods, either because if you move to other neighborhoods, you might get killed. There was literally a street that separated Bronzeville from its neighboring neighborhood to the west, where Richard Daley lived, called the Deadline, right? And when Langston Hughes took a walk across the Deadline in 1918, he got beaten up, right? Like, and so that segregation was a product of the post-1919 riots in the city of Chicago. And then it continues actually to this day. If you know Chicago, it's one of the most segregated cities in the country by race.
Thank you. And I just want to remind the audience that you can drop any questions you have in the question and answer, and we'll get to those at the end. I just want to pivot here to Dr. Faustina DuCros and go further west to Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us. And if you could just maybe speak a little bit about the first Black migrants to Los Angeles, and what were some of the push factors in Louisiana in particular, where much of your research is centered, but also the pull factors for Los Angeles, because it's pretty far out, literally on the West Coast, for somebody coming from the Gulf of Mexico. So what was the reason for traveling so far, and why leave Louisiana in the first place?
Yeah, again, thanks for having me, and I'm enjoying, listening to my colleagues here. So certainly California and Los Angeles in particular, there's been a Black presence there for a long time, even before the Great Migration. It's kind of started with the Spanish colonial project, where you had some of a big majority of the first residents who established Los Angeles under that Spanish colonial project were Afro Spanish, essentially, right? Because it wasn't quite Mexico yet. And so you had a little over half of those first settlers there establishing Los Angeles. And then, as time went on, by the 1860s, and that was, I should say that's kind of like in the late 1700s. In the 1800s, right, we had about 66 Black people in LA were counted in 1860. And there were folks there that were largely working for white people, right? Mostly formerly enslaved people who came with officers who were fighting in the Mexican War. And so that's kind of like that period. one of the attracting factors at that point was that there was, comparatively less anti-Black racism, right, in the West and in the, the frontiers, right? And not that there was, definitely there was still there, but it was less so than in the South. By 1910, LA had the largest Black population in California. It sort of flipped from San Francisco, which was kind of like the predominant Black population during the, the gold rush, and all of that expansion up in the Northern California kind of brought people there first. But by 1910, it was the biggest population. We had about, let's see, 7,600 Black people out of 319,000 in that period. And so from the 1880s to about 1910, the attraction was land. There were about 40% of Black residents in LA were homeowners. So that was very different than other places in the United States at that time. And partly because it was so spread out, right? Because that land was kind of largely available, right? It wasn't offending, the white people that were there if they didn't see the concentrations of Black people right near them. It wasn't quite as much of a problem. But as we have more people coming in with the the beginnings of the Great Migration, we see a huge jump. It's over double or about double, right? By 1920, 1930s, we're going from about 16,000 to almost 40,000 Black people in Los Angeles. And again, the attraction is the relative kind of freedoms, right, compared to the South. There was that space. The jobs that were available were similar in terms of service in industries like waiters and porters, janitors, messengers, cooks, things like that. But there was also the railroads that were part of bringing people to the West, because you had the option for working as like porters and waiters on the railroad. And again, it was a way of transporting people to the West and exposing people to that opportunity. It was also, relatively middle class kind of position because it was a steady income for Black people at that time, right? So there were people who were seeing what was available in California and deciding to, bring family out and settle. Even though there was that growth before the beginning of the Great Migration, again, we see it really multiplying and exponentially, right? By even in 30s, again, we have about 40,000, but by 1940, there's 63,000 Black people in Los Angeles. And so we're kind of seeing jumps from like, less than 1%, 2%, 3%, and now we're at like 4% of the population. And it keeps growing. We're doubling again in 1950 to almost 200,000. Some numbers are like over 2,000, some are just under, depending on how those are calculated. 60s, we jump again and we're at 300,000+. And even in 1970, there were 500,000 Black people in LA. So it's, it was kind of continuing through before we see that kind of downward trend after the Great Migration period from, into the 80s and 90s. But so again, the jobs were there that were similar, but again, more racial freedom. In World War II, we see the biggest jump, as we've been hearing, and partly because of the war industries that were in California, Los Angeles, and even the Bay Area. Those opportunities were there, even though there was still, discrimination happening in those types of industries, but they started to open up over time. Just growth in California was different, right? So a lot of people coming from Louisiana were in building trades. And so, if there's growth happening in building, then you'll also have jobs in that regard. We still, again, had manufacturing service. There was some professional service, there were always doctors and, lawyers and barbers and that kind of thing within the Black communities everywhere. And so you also had those kind of jobs to serve the larger Black communities in all of the, all of the different cities. So I don't know, let me pause there and you can like follow up and see
So I have a quick
where we
question,
want to go.
specifically about Creole people. So like
Yeah.
not everybody would necessarily identify as just Black going to
Right.
as they migrate from the South, and specifically Louisiana, like
Mhm.
picking like New Orleans and Baton Rouge, the Creole
Mhm.
communities. Sort of what are some of the differences that maybe Creoles experienced when they arrived, people who identified as Creole, and how did Los Angeles shape their identity, and how did they
Mhm.
then in turn maybe shape the Creole identity, or how
Mhm.
was Louisiana at all shaped by their existence in Los Angeles?
Yeah, so yes, Louisiana is its own kind of particular context in the United States, right? It has this relatively unique racial history. Some of the Gulf states have this too, but it was really pronounced in Louisiana in terms of migration coming from Saint-Domingue, or what's now Haiti, right after the revolution. You had people of color who were free kind of coming into Louisiana. There were already other free people of color in Louisiana. And so because of its colonial history with, French ownership for a long period of time, Spanish ownership for a little bit of time in there as well. Those societies, French and Spanish, had different ways of understanding race that really influenced Louisiana's like racial structure, right? So it wasn't so binary as it was in other parts of what was the United States, or the colonies at depending on what time we're looking at. But so that racial history kind of stayed in Louisiana all throughout its period to the contemporary, right? And so when you had people who were perceived to be mixed race, this becomes its own third space in that racial hierarchy. So that's happening in Louisiana, and you have people coming out of that state, right, who are part of the Creole community, which again is this kind of sort of third space in service of white supremacy, right? Becomes this kind of buffer between the if we're talking about the postbellum era, right, the newly freed Black population, but there are racial tensions, right, because of the relative privileges that happen when there's this third space created or carved out and enforced by various people, right? But ultimately, after Reconstruction ends, everyone is kind of affected by Jim Crow, right? And so everyone is subject to segregation, and all of the things that go with that, the violence, the limited opportunities for jobs and in education and so forth. So that's kind of the context. And so when we have Black people who are Creole or not Creole coming to California, they're coming with that history, right? That context, that socialization. In some ways, California provided some flexibility for people who were identifying with or thought of themselves as Creole. There's a whole spectrum of appearance within the Creole community, from Black appearing or presenting to white appearing, right? And so you have some racial ambiguity there, but it is still, again, part of the spectrum of Blackness. But for those who are more racially ambiguous, there are more opportunities, right? Because in Louisiana, where you lived and where you went to school, even if you didn't look Black, still circumscribed your opportunities, right? Because everyone knew, like, oh, that's a Black school, or that's a Black area, and so you couldn't get away from those constraints in the same way as you could elsewhere, right? So again, for some people who were racially ambiguous, there were those added opportunities. But for people who were not, whether they were Creole or African American, there's a distinction in Louisiana of like American Black and Creole Black, essentially, historically. But if you looked Black, you still were kind of hitting up against those barriers in California, but again, in a different way, right? What was, segregation by law in Louisiana was more de facto, segregation in California. Early on, there was like, if we're talking about like those 1800s periods, there was less like kind of residential segregation on the books, but it did kind of come as we saw more Black people coming into the area, that there was more instituted policies, right, to constrain people. So, where people lived was impacted, right? Most Black people kind of went to Los Angeles and lived in this kind of central Avenue neighborhood. That was kind of like the hub for the Black community in the early 1900s. But as World War II went on and some of the housing segregation was getting pushed away, right? There was some landmark cases that kind of started to open things up. People started to move more westward. And so Creoles, for example, if there were some racial ambiguities there, they might be able to kind of turn neighborhoods. They'd be like the first pioneers in a neighborhood that was white. And then like the rest of the family would come, right? And then you'd have white flight. So, because like maybe one person appeared white, but like the children or the spouse or whoever, right, was Black, right? Or cousins came. And so, those were some ways that there might be some differences and, advantages because of the way that the white supremacist kind of, housing market and, everything was working. Same in terms of jobs. Some people would tell me about, especially if you were like in construction trades or, looking for manufacturing with the war industry, shops, people would go get turned away. They were like with friends. If we're talking about like somebody who's racially ambiguous and somebody who's not, right? They get turned away, but they could go back and maybe try to get in on their own if they were racially ambiguous, right? Some people would kind of fit in with the Mexican American kind of appearance, right? And would be able to get jobs that way. So there's some advantages depending on racial presentation that happened there.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. I think that's it's such a very sort of complicated.
Yeah, there's so much in there.
The social construct is inherently very complicated and very subjective depending on where you are in the world and in the country. So that's a really great answer. I know we're tight on time here. Bruce Rosen had dropped a few questions in the Q&A. So if y'all want to take a stab at answering any of those, you can go ahead and just type the answer. But I guess since we're so tight on time, I'll just leave with this final question for the floor, for everybody. Sort of, how do you best theorize the Great Migration as a true migration of migrants, or because of the factors of the violence that maybe people were fleeing or the restrictions in economic opportunity? Are there more refugees almost? And do you think that distinction matters, or is it more, parlance or playing with it?
I conceptualize them as migrants rather than refugees. I mean, they weren't fleeing as much as they were searching for new opportunities and new possibilities. And many other African Americans remain in the South because the migration, it was a two-part migration. It was a migration out of the South, but it was also a migration from the rural countryside into the urban centers. So it was a structural shift driven by economic changes that were sparked by the rise of the knowledge economy and the breakup of the colonial worlds in World War II. So it was a mass urban-based movement where African Americans were being transformed from a rural people to an urban people centered in both the North, Midwestern, and Western and Eastern cities.
So that's an awesome answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add too, it's interesting because, you know, I also talk about migrants, right? And I did oral history or life history interviews with people. And so when I, you know, was recruiting people, you know, I'd say migrants from Louisiana kind of broadly. I didn't kind of define it by Creole or Black or, you know, any kind of racial, just to kind of see who I would get. But even migrants kind of sat funny with the participants that I talked to, right? Because we think of migration, or, you know, the common sense kind of idea is that it's immigrants from other countries, right? But it definitely is this migration, and you know, because people were moving, right, and searching and looking. Sometimes there was that return migration. So, but it's interesting. And then you might get into, you know, like with Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, right? When the label of refugee was kind of put on people who were fleeing, right? That kind of also didn't sit well, right? Because, you know, Black people have been here and built the country, right? And it kind of puts that, you know, that outsider kind of label on people who've been here for so long, right? And we couldn't have this country without us.
And I think it's also a part of this cultural thinking among Blacks of you can move to freedom. And a major theme in Black people in Black history is people wanting to move to freedom, whether that's moving from slavery to freedom, moving to the North, or moving into the suburbs, moving back south. This idea and notion that somewhere within the American construct, there is some promised land, you know, the term that has been used so often. And if we can just move to that promised land, you know, we'll be okay. And that's been embedded in, let's go back to Africa, let's go back to this place, as opposed to, we're gonna have to fight to transform and change this place. There's no place to move.
And also one other thing I just want to add to that is just the maintaining of networks between migrants and those who are back home, right? That those networks were still maintained, and it wasn't as if they were, you know, had moved north and there was no more, you know, interaction between the communities from which they left. And so that could be financial, it could be, you know, in terms of like physical visiting or things like that, just to kind of keep that in mind as part of the migration experience as well.
So I thank you all for your answers, and I really thank you all for joining me today. I know we went a little bit over, so apologies. Keep an eye out for further Black History content, even after Black History Month ends, from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in NYC. Thank you to all the panelists and all the guests who joined as well. Really appreciate your time, and I hope to see you all again very soon.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.